Elias adjusted his cloak as he trudged through the dense forest, the ancient trees towering above him like silent sentinels. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth, and the fading light of the late afternoon filtered through the canopy in scattered rays. He had been traveling for days, following a trail of rumors about an ancient ruin hidden in these woods, one that supposedly held secrets about the enigmatic beast folk. His curiosity burned brighter than his caution, though he remained wary of the dangers lurking in uncharted territories. The forest seemed to close in around him as the path grew narrower. Suddenly, the faint rustle of leaves caught his attention. Elias stopped, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the short blade at his side. He scanned the surroundings, but the thick undergrowth revealed nothing. Just as he took another cautious step, a shadow darted across his peripheral vision. Before he could react, a powerful force collided with him, knocking him off his feet. His blade clattered to the ground as he was pinned by a weight far heavier than any human. Elias gasped, looking up into the sharp, golden eyes of a creature that was half woman, half beast. She had the sleek fur of a predator, her ears twitching as she growled low in her throat. "He's the one," the beast woman said, her voice rough but undeniably feminine. Two others emerged from the shadows, their forms equally imposing. They moved with a predatory grace, their gazes fixed on Elias as if he were prey. "Let me go." Elias struggled, but the beast woman holding him tightened her grip. Her claws pressed just enough against his chest to warn him against further resistance. "You're coming with us, human," she said. Her voice carried a tone of authority, leaving no room for negotiation. Elias's mind raced as the women bound his wrists and lifted him to his feet. He was outnumbered and unarmed. His protests fell on deaf ears as they guided him deeper into the forest, their pace relentless. The fading light soon gave way to the glow of a distant fire. They emerged into a hidden enclave, surrounded by jagged cliffs that offered no escape. At the center of the encampment stood a massive bonfire, its light illuminating a crowd of beast folk. They turned as Elias was dragged into their midst, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and desperation. Murmurs rippled through the group, and a path opened to reveal a commanding figure striding forward. The woman was taller than the rest, her fur a deep, midnight black that shimmered in the firelight. Her presence exuded power, and her piercing gaze silenced the crowd as she approached. The beast woman holding Elias stepped aside, bowing her head. "This is him, Kayla," she said. "The human we need." Kayla's eyes locked onto Elias, her expression unreadable. She circled him slowly, her movements deliberate, like a predator assessing its prey. Elias held her gaze, refusing to show fear despite his pounding heart. "You're brave," Kayla said, her voice smoother than the others but laced with a quiet intensity. "Good. That will make this easier." Elias straightened. "Easier for what? What do you want from me?" Kayla stopped in front of him, her eyes narrowing. "Our kind is dying, human. Infertility spreads like a plague among us. If we do nothing, we will vanish within a generation." Elias's breath hitched as the gravity of her words sank in. He had heard whispers of declining beast folk numbers, but he hadn't imagined it was this dire. "And what does that have to do with me?" he asked, though he suspected the answer. Kayla's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Your kind carries what we lack. You will help us, willingly or not." Elias's defiance flared. "You can't just kidnap people and expect them to agree to something like this." Kayla leaned in, her face inches from his. Her breath was warm, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and something more primal. "We don't have the luxury of waiting for consent, human. Desperation has stripped us of that." Elias swallowed hard, his resolve faltering under her intense gaze. Before he could reply, Kayla stepped back and motioned for her warriors. "Take him to my tent. I'll speak with him alone." The crowd parted once more as Elias was led to a large tent at the edge of the camp. Inside, the space was surprisingly well furnished. A large, fur-covered bed dominated the center, and the soft glow of lanterns cast warm light over the room. The guards untied his wrists, and left without a word. Elias rubbed his wrists, his eyes darting around the tent for any means of escape. Before he could act, Kayla entered, her presence filling the space. She closed the tent flap behind her and approached him with measured steps. "You must understand," she began, her tone softer now. "I take no pleasure in this, but my people depend on me to save them." Elias clenched his fists. "And you think forcing me will save them?" Kayla's expression softened for a moment, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her features. "I won't lie to you. This isn't how I wanted it to be." She reached out, her clawed fingers brushing against his arm. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, sending a shiver down his spine. "But if there's any chance we can forge a bond, it will benefit both our kinds." Elias pulled away, his breath uneven. "I don't even know you." Kayla stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. "Then let's change that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She raised a hand to his face, her claws lightly tracing the line of his jaw. Her touch was deliberate, yet tender, her eyes searching his for any sign of willingness. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The tension between them was palpable, a mix of fear, defiance, and something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Elias felt his pulse quicken, torn between resistance and a strange curiosity about the woman standing before him. Kayla leaned in, her breath ghosting against his lips. "We have much to learn from each other," she said, her voice a low murmur. "And little time to waste." Elias's heart raced as the weight of her words settled over him. The stakes were clear, and his choices, limited as they were, would shape the fate of not only himself, but an entire race. The firelight flickered in her eyes, and Elias knew his journey had only just begun. Elias sat on the edge of the fur-lined bed, his mind racing as he tried to process his predicament. The heavy silence in Kayla's tent was broken only by the crackling of a small fire in the corner. He couldn't shake the weight of her words or the urgency in her eyes. Her people were on the brink of extinction, and now he was at the center of their desperate plan. The tent flap rustled as Kayla entered, carrying a clay jug of water. She moved with the same fluid grace Elias had noticed before, her sharp eyes glancing at him as she set the jug down on a nearby table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You've been quiet," Kayla said finally, her voice softer than before. She poured water into a cup and handed it to him. "Drink. You'll need your strength." Elias took the cup hesitantly, his throat dry from the day's events. He drank slowly, keeping his gaze on her. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Kayla sat across from him, her posture relaxed but her expression serious. "Now, we begin to understand each other," she said. "If this is to work, we need trust, even if it's only a fragile thread." Elias set the cup aside, leaning forward slightly. "You talk about trust, but you kidnapped me. How do you expect me to trust you?" Kayla's ears twitched, and a faint shadow of regret crossed her face. "I don't," she admitted. "Not yet, but I hope to earn it." She stood and approached him slowly, her towering presence both intimidating and strangely reassuring. "Let me show you why we fight so hard to survive." She extended her hand, claws retracted, waiting for him to take it. Elias hesitated, but eventually placed his hand in hers. Her grip was firm yet gentle as she pulled him to his feet. Without a word, she led him out of the tent and into the cool night air. The camp was quiet, most of the beast folk having retreated to their own spaces. The massive bonfire at the center had burned down to embers, casting a warm glow over the clearing. Kayla guided Elias toward a narrow path leading into the woods. They walked in silence, the only sounds being the soft rustle of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. After a short walk, they arrived at a small clearing where a lone tree stood, its bark pale and shimmering faintly under the moonlight. Beneath it was a stone altar, etched with intricate symbols. Kayla stopped and gestured toward it. "This is the heart of our people," she said quietly. "The elder tree. It has stood here for generations, protecting us and guiding our leaders. But now, even it shows signs of decay." She ran her fingers along the bark, her expression solemn. Without new life, it will wither, and so will we. Elias approached the tree, his curiosity piqued. He could feel a faint energy emanating from it, a pulse that seemed to resonate with the earth itself. "What do you need from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kayla turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "You carry the vitality that we've lost. Your people still thrive while ours falter. We need to create a bond strong enough to heal what's broken." She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "It starts with us." Elias felt his pulse quicken as Kayla closed the distance between them. Her presence was overwhelming, but there was no malice in her eyes, only determination. She raised a hand, her fingers brushing against his cheek. Her touch was warm, her fur soft against his skin. "I know this isn't what you wanted," she said, her voice barely audible. "But if we can find even a small connection, it could change everything." Elias searched her face, seeing for the first time the weight she carried as a leader. Her fierce exterior masked a deep vulnerability, one that spoke of a burden she couldn't bear alone. Slowly, he nodded. "I don't know if I can help," he said, "but I'll try." Kayla's expression softened, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. "That's all I ask." She leaned in, her forehead resting gently against his. Elias tensed at first, but her warmth and steady breathing began to calm him. It was an intimate moment, one that spoke of trust more than words ever could. Kayla pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his for any sign of hesitation. When Elias didn't pull away, she tilted her head and pressed her lips to his in a tentative kiss. It was gentle at first, a mere brush of lips that quickly deepened as they found a rhythm. Elias's hands rested on her arms, his touch light but steady. For a moment, the world around them faded, leaving only the quiet connection they shared. Kayla pulled back slowly, her eyes half-lidded as she studied him. "There's hope in you, Elias," she said softly. "More than you realize." Elias felt a strange mix of emotions, confusion, fear, and a growing sense of resolve. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew he couldn't turn away now. The stakes were too high, and Kayla's unwavering determination was beginning to stir something within him. Kayla stepped back, her expression once again composed. "We'll continue this tomorrow," she said. "Rest for now. You'll need your strength for what's to come." Elias nodded, following her back to the camp. As they walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that his journey had only just begun. The weight of their shared mission pressed heavily on his shoulders, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection, his thoughts lingering on the woman who had brought him into this strange, desperate world. The morning sun filtered through the fabric of the tent, casting a soft glow over Elias as he stirred from sleep. His mind was slow to wake, the events of the previous night returning in a haze. The conversation with Kayla, their shared vulnerability beneath the elder tree, and the unexpected kiss lingered in his thoughts. He wasn't sure what to make of it. Everything about this situation felt surreal, yet the weight of their mission was undeniable. Elias sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The camp was already bustling outside. The sounds of distant voices and the crackling of fires reached his ears. He took a deep breath and stepped out into the fresh morning air. The beast folk moved with purpose, their routines blending seamlessly between the duties of survival and preparation. Despite their dire circumstances, there was a sense of unity among them, a silent acknowledgement of their shared struggle. Kayla was waiting near the central bonfire, her arms crossed as she spoke with one of the warriors. When her eyes met Elias's, she dismissed the other beast woman with a nod and approached him. "You slept well, I hope," she said, her tone steady but not unkind. "Well enough," Elias replied. "What's the plan for today?" Kayla gave a slight smile, though her gaze remained serious. "Today, we test your resolve. If you're truly willing to help, you'll need to prove it." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Prove it how?" Kayla motioned for him to follow her, and they walked toward the edge of the camp. The path led to a clearing where a group of beast folk warriors were gathered. At the center of the group stood Naira, her imposing figure radiating raw strength. Her sharp, icy gaze fixed on Elias the moment he entered the clearing. So, this is the human, Naira said, her voice dripping with disdain. She crossed her arms, her tail flicking behind her. I expected more. Elias felt a flicker of irritation but kept his composure. And you are? Naira, she said simply. Second in command here. And I don't trust you. Elias glanced at Kayla, who remained calm. She's been skeptical from the start, Kayla explained. But skepticism is not our enemy. Prove your worth, and you'll silence her doubts. Naira stepped forward, her imposing figure towering over Elias. You want us to believe that a fragile human can help save our people? She scoffed. Let's see if you can handle even the smallest challenge. Elias braced himself as Naira's claws extended slightly, her stance shifting into a combat-ready position. You'll spar with me, she said. Show me that you're more than just a liability. Wait, spar. Elias glanced at Kayla, but she simply nodded. You've faced challenges before, Kayla said. This is no different. Trust in your instincts. Elias swallowed hard but stepped into the circle. Naira wasted no time, lunging forward with impressive speed. Elias barely dodged her first swipe, stumbling back as she pressed her attack. Her strikes were controlled but relentless, each one testing his reflexes and resolve. Despite the odds, Elias found himself adapting. He remembered his training from years of exploring dangerous territories, where quick thinking and agility often meant the difference between life and death. He sidestepped another blow, using Naira's momentum against her to create space. The warriors watching murmured in surprise, and even Naira's expression shifted slightly. She pressed on, but Elias met her strikes with increasing confidence, his movements more calculated with each exchange. Finally, he saw an opening and used his shoulder to push her off balance. Naira stumbled back, breathing heavily. She raised a hand, signaling the end of the match. Not bad, she admitted, her tone begrudging. You have some fight in you after all. Elias caught his breath, sweat beading on his forehead. Kayla stepped forward, her expression unreadable. You've proven you're not just a scholar, she said. That's a start. Naira gave a curt nod, though her gaze remained sharp. I still don't trust him, she said. But I'll admit, he's not as weak as I thought. Kayla turned to Elias, her voice low. You've earned their respect, but this is only the beginning. There's more at stake than just strength. As the group dispersed, Naira lingered for a moment before walking away. Elias felt a mix of relief and pride, but knew that earning trust in this camp would be a slow process. Kayla placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch firm but reassuring. You did well, she said. Now, let's focus on the next step. Later that day, Kayla led Elias back to the elder tree. They stood in its shadow as she explained more about the ritual they had uncovered. The bond we're trying to forge isn't just physical, she said. It's spiritual. It requires a connection deeper than instinct, one that ties us to the energy of the world itself. Elias listened intently, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always been a man of logic and reason, but this experience was pushing him beyond the boundaries of what he understood. Kayla stepped closer, her voice softer now. To succeed, we must trust each other completely. That trust begins here. She reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. Her touch was light, but there was an unmistakable warmth to it. Elias met her gaze, sensing the vulnerability she rarely showed. He placed his hand over hers, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they were beginning to form. I'm with you, he said quietly. Whatever it takes. Kayla's expression softened, and for a moment, they stood in quiet understanding. The journey ahead was uncertain, but they were no longer walking it alone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in shades of gold and crimson, Elias felt a growing resolve. The trials would only grow more challenging, but together, they would face them head-on. Elias had barely finished a simple meal when Kayla approached him again, her expression unreadable, but her presence commanding. She had allowed him only a brief reprieve after the sparring session, and now it seemed she had more in store. He wiped his hands on his cloak and stood as she gestured for him to follow. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp. Kayla led him past the bustling fires and toward the outskirts, where the forest thickened. The silence between them felt heavier with each step, and Elias couldn't shake the feeling that another test awaited him. When they reached a secluded clearing, Kayla finally spoke. "This place is sacred," she said, her voice low. "It's where our leaders have come for generations to meditate and reflect. You'll need to understand its significance if you're to help us." Elias glanced around. The clearing was encircled by ancient stones, each one etched with intricate symbols similar to those on the altar beneath the elder tree. In the center stood a smooth stone slab, slightly raised and illuminated by the warm, golden light of the setting sun. Kayla stepped closer to the slab and placed her hand on its surface. "This stone represents balance," she explained. "It's where we come to center ourselves, to connect with the energy of the land and the spirit of our people." Elias nodded, though he still wasn't sure where this was leading. "And what do you need me to do?" Kayla turned to face him, her eyes serious but not unkind. "Sit with me," she said simply. Elias hesitated but complied, lowering himself onto the slab beside her. The stone was cool against his skin, grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. Kayla's presence beside him was steady, her focus unwavering as she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Feel the energy around you," she instructed. "Let it guide you." Elias closed his eyes, unsure of what he was supposed to feel. At first, there was only the quiet rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. But as he sat in silence, a subtle hum began to rise beneath him, as if the earth itself was alive and pulsing with quiet power. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Kayla's voice broke the stillness, softer now. "You sense it, don't you?" Elias opened his eyes slowly and met her gaze. "I think so. It's different." Kayla gave a small nod. "Good. That connection is what we need to strengthen. It's what ties us to the elder tree, to each other, and to the land." For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the weight of the world around them seemingly lighter. Then, Kayla shifted slightly, her hand resting just inches from his on the stone. Elias noticed the movement, his pulse quickening as the proximity between them grew more intimate. "There's more to this connection," Kayla said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just about understanding the land or our people. It's about understanding each other." Elias felt the tension between them deepen, a magnetic pull that was both exhilarating and unsettling. Kayla's eyes searched his, her expression unreadable, yet filled with an unspoken question. Without thinking, Elias reached out, his hand brushing against hers. Her fur was warm, softer than he expected, and her fingers curled slightly in response. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of something far more profound. Kayla leaned in, her gaze never leaving his. "We're stronger together," she murmured, "but only if we trust one another." Elias swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "I want to trust you," he said. This is all so much." Kayla's expression softened, and she moved her hand to rest gently on his arm. "You're doing more than I expected," she admitted. "You've shown courage, even when you didn't have to." The sincerity in her voice caught Elias off guard, and for a moment, he felt a warmth that went beyond the physical. It was a connection that defied logic, something rooted in the shared vulnerability they had both begun to expose. Kayla's hand lingered on his arm, her touch light but deliberate. Elias felt his resolve falter as the space between them seemed to shrink. Her gaze dropped briefly to his lips, and he knew what was coming before it happened. When she leaned in, their lips met in a slow, deliberate kiss. It was gentle at first, testing the boundaries of this fragile bond. But as the moment stretched, it deepened, carrying a warmth that seemed to radiate through both of them. Elias's hand found her shoulder, his grip light but steady as he leaned into the kiss. Kayla's other hand rested against his chest, Her claws retracted as she allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. The kiss was both a promise and a challenge, a silent agreement to face whatever lay ahead together. When they finally pulled apart, their breaths mingling in the cool evening air, Kayla's eyes held a softness Elias hadn't seen before. "We'll take this one step at a time," she said quietly. "But you've already shown me more than I hoped for." Elias nodded, his heart still racing. "I'll do what I can," he said. "For you. For your people." Kayla gave him a small, grateful smile and stood, extending a hand to help him up. "Come," she said. "There's more to prepare before the ritual." As they made their way back to the camp, the bond between them felt stronger, though Elias knew there were still challenges ahead. Trust had begun to form, but trust alone wouldn't be enough. They would need strength, courage, and a unity that transcended their differences. And as the shadows of the forest deepened around them, Elias couldn't help but feel that their journey was far from over. Elias felt the subtle shift in the camp's energy as the days passed. The beast folk around him seemed more focused, their movements purposeful, their eyes sharper. He couldn't help but feel the weight of their expectations. Though Kayla had softened toward him, there were still those who eyed him with suspicion, and none more so than Naira. It was during one of the quiet afternoons, when Elias was reviewing the ancient texts Kayla had granted him access to, that Naira approached. Her presence was impossible to ignore. She moved with the confidence of a predator, her piercing eyes fixed on him as she crossed the distance between them. "You've been busy," she said, her voice carrying a hint of mockery. "Studying our ways, trying to fit in." Elias set the worn scroll aside and met her gaze. "I'm trying to help," he said evenly. "For your people's sake." Naira's lip curled slightly, but it wasn't quite a smile. "You think reading old stories will save us? That bonding with Kayla will solve everything." Elias stood, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "I don't know if it will," he admitted, "but it's a start. What would you have me do, Naira? Run away and leave you all to your fate?" Naira stepped closer, her imposing frame nearly eclipsing his. "I would have you prove yourself," she said, her tone challenging. "You're Kayla's choice, but you haven't earned my trust." Elias held her gaze, unflinching. "Then tell me what it'll take." Naira's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she seemed to weigh his words carefully. "Meet me in the training grounds at dusk," she said. "We'll see if your actions can back up your words." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, leaving Elias with a sense of unease. He knew this wasn't just a test of skill, it was a battle for respect, for legitimacy in the eyes of those who still doubted him. When dusk fell, Elias found himself standing in the center of the training grounds. The space was surrounded by a ring of beast folk warriors, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Naira stood across from him, her stance poised and ready. She wore a smirk that spoke of confidence, but her eyes betrayed a deeper determination. Kayla stood at the edge of the circle, her expression calm but watchful. Elias drew strength from her presence, though he knew she wouldn't interfere. Naira stepped forward, her claws glinting in the fading light. "This isn't about fighting," she said, her voice carrying over the gathered crowd. "It's about showing us who you are." Elias nodded, his grip tightening on the training staff he'd been handed. "Then let's get started." The first clash was swift and brutal. Naira moved like lightning, her strikes precise and unrelenting. Elias barely had time to react, blocking her blows with his staff as she drove him back. The force of her attacks was overwhelming, but he refused to yield. The crowd watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. Each strike echoed in the stillness, a rhythmic dance of power and resistance. Elias gritted his teeth, focusing on Naira's movements, looking for patterns and openings. Finally, he saw his chance. As Naira lunged forward, Elias sidestepped and swept his staff low, catching her off balance. She stumbled, but only for a moment. Her recovery was quick, and she came at him with renewed vigor. The fight continued, both combatants pushing themselves to their limits. Elias could feel his muscles burning, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. But he refused to give up. Each time Naira struck, he met her with equal determination, his resolve growing stronger with every clash. Then, in a sudden burst of energy, Elias parried Naira's attack and used her momentum to drive her back. She fell to one knee, breathing heavily as she stared up at him. For a moment, the entire camp seemed to hold its breath. Elias extended a hand toward her, his expression calm but resolute. "I'm not your enemy," he said. "I'm here to stand with you." Naira hesitated, her eyes searching his for any sign of weakness. Slowly, she reached out and took his hand, allowing him to help her to her feet. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. "You've earned this moment," Naira said quietly, her tone grudgingly respectful. "But don't think for a second that you've seen the worst of me." Elias gave a small, tired smile. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As the crowd dispersed, Kayla approached, her eyes filled with a quiet pride. "You did well," she said, her voice low. "Naira doesn't give respect easily." Elias nodded, exhaustion finally beginning to set in. "I just hope it's enough." Kayla placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "It's more than enough. You've shown them what I already knew. You're stronger than they give you credit for." Elias met her gaze, a flicker of warmth passing between them. Despite the challenges he faced, he felt a growing sense of belonging, a connection that went beyond words. As the night deepened, Elias and Kayla walked back toward her tent. The camp was quieter now, the tension from earlier replaced by a sense of calm. They didn't speak, but the silence between them was comfortable, a shared understanding that needed no explanation. When they reached the tent, Kayla paused, her hand lingering on the flap. She turned to Elias, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. "Thank you," she said simply. Elias nodded, his heart heavy but steady. "We're in this together." Kayla gave him a small smile before stepping inside, leaving Elias alone under the starlit sky. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The path ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't face it alone. Elias awoke to the soft hum of the camp stirring around him. The air was cool, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the tents. His muscles ached from the previous night's sparring, but there was a sense of accomplishment beneath the fatigue. He had stood his ground, earned a measure of respect, and for the first time, he felt like he might actually belong. As he stepped out of his tent, he saw Kayla waiting nearby, her arms crossed as she leaned against a tree. She gave him a nod of acknowledgement as he approached. "Ready for another day?" she asked, a hint of warmth in her tone. Elias stretched his shoulders, wincing slightly. "If it's anything like yesterday, I might need a few more hours of sleep." Kayla chuckled softly, her ears twitching. "You've earned your rest, but there's still work to be done." She gestured toward the elder tree, its ancient branches swaying gently in the breeze. "We need to prepare for the ritual." Elias nodded, the weight of their mission settling over him once more. Together, they walked toward the heart of the camp, where the elder tree loomed like a guardian over the village. Its presence was a constant reminder of what was at stake. As they approached, Elias noticed several beast folk gathered around the stone altar. They were arranging offerings, bowls of fruit, bundles of herbs, and carved wooden totems, all meticulously placed in a circle around the base of a tree. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, the smoke curling upward like a prayer. Kayla led him to the altar, her expression serious. "The ritual requires both of us to be fully committed," she said. "It's not just a physical connection, but a merging of our spirits." Elias met her gaze, feeling the intensity of her words. "I understand," he said. "I'm ready." Kayla's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Good. But there's something else you need to know." Before she could continue, a voice interrupted them. "So this is where the great ritual begins." Naira stepped forward, her arms crossed, a sharp edge to her tone. The other beast folk fell silent, their eyes darting between her and Kayla. Kayla's expression tightened, but she remained composed. "Naira, this isn't the time. Naira smirked, her gaze flicking to Elias. I just want to make sure our human friend understands what he's getting into. She stepped closer, her presence as commanding as ever. This ritual is dangerous. If either of you falters, it could weaken the bond and do more harm than good. Elias frowned, glancing at Kayla. Is that true? Kayla hesitated before nodding. It's a risk, but one we must take. The bond we forge will determine the future of our people. Naira's eyes narrowed. And you trust him without responsibility? Kayla's gaze didn't waver. I do. The tension between them was palpable, but Naira finally relented with a slight nod. Then I hope you're right, she said, her voice low. For all our sakes. She turned and walked away, leaving an uneasy silence in her wake. Elias exhaled slowly, the weight of Naira's words pressing on him. He looked at Kayla, who gave him a reassuring nod. We'll get through this, she said. Together. The preparations continued throughout the day, with Elias and Kayla working side by side. They gathered sacred herbs, recited ancient incantations, and focused their energy on strengthening the bond between them. Each task brought them closer, their connection growing with every shared moment. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the camp, Kayla led Elias to a secluded spot near the edge of the forest. The quiet hum of the village faded into the background, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. Kayla turned to face him, her expression serious yet gentle. This is our final step before the ritual, she said. We need to align our energies completely. Elias nodded, though his heart raced with anticipation. He could feel the gravity of the moment, the unspoken tension between them. Kayla stepped closer, her gaze locked onto his. Trust me, she whispered. I do, Elias replied, his voice steady. Kayla placed her hands on his shoulders, her touch firm yet comforting. Slowly, she leaned in, her forehead resting against his. Their breaths mingled, and Elias felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet hum of energy that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. They stayed like that for a moment, their connection deepening. Kayla's hands moved down to rest on his arms, her touch gentle but deliberate. Elias felt his own hands rise to her sides, his fingers lightly tracing the contours of her frame. It was an unspoken exchange, a blending of their trust and vulnerability. Kayla tilted her head slightly, her eyes half-lidded as she closed the distance between them. Their lips met in a slow, deliberate kiss, a continuation of the bond they had been building. It was tender, yet filled with a quiet intensity, a shared understanding of the stakes they faced. When they finally pulled apart, Kayla's eyes searched his, her expression softer than he had ever seen. We're ready, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias nodded, his resolve solidified. Together, they returned to the elder tree, where the gathered beast folk awaited them. The air was charged with anticipation, the soft glow of the moon casting an ethereal light over the clearing. As they stepped forward, Kayla and Elias stood side by side before the altar, their hands clasped together. The ritual was about to begin, and with it, the hope of a future for both their worlds. The gathered beast folk encircled the elder tree, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of dozens of torches. The air was heavy with anticipation, the scent of burning herbs mingling with the cool night breeze. Elias stood beside Kayla at the altar, his hand still clasped in hers. Despite the weight of the moment, her grip was steady, a silent reassurance that they were in this together. Kayla stepped forward, her voice clear and commanding as she addressed the gathered crowd. Tonight, we seek to restore the bond that has long been broken. This human stands with us, not as an outsider, but as a bridge between our worlds. The crowd murmured in agreement, their eyes reflecting both hope and uncertainty. Kayla turned to Elias, her gaze steady. Are you ready? Elias nodded, his heart pounding. I'm ready. Kayla gave a small nod of approval and began to chant in the ancient tongue of her people. The words flowed like a river, carrying a rhythm that seemed to resonate with the very earth beneath them. Elias closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him as he focused on the energy, surrounding the elder tree. The hum he had felt earlier was now a steady pulse, growing stronger with each word of the chant. Kayla's voice rose, and the other beast folk joined in, their collective energy filling the clearing. Elias could feel it coursing through him, a connection that went beyond the physical, binding him to the land and the people around him. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and a faint glow emanated from the roots of the elder tree. The ritual was working. Elias opened his eyes to see the ancient symbols on the altar lighting up, their intricate patterns pulsing with life. But just as the energy reached its peak, a sharp cry broke through the chant. "Stop this!" Naira's voice rang out, cutting through the night like a blade. The chanting faltered as all eyes turned toward her. She stood at the edge of the clearing, flanked by a group of warriors loyal to her. Her expression was a mix of anger and fear, her claws flexed as she stepped forward. "This ritual is a farce," she spat, her gaze fixed on Kayla. "You're putting our people's future in the hands of a human. It's madness." Kayla's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained calm. "Naira, we've been over this. The ritual is our only chance." Naira shook her head, her tail lashing behind her. "You're blinded by hope, Kayla. You're risking everything on a gamble. If this fails, it won't just be the human who pays the price. It will be all of us." Elias could feel the tension in the air, the energy of the ritual now crackling like static. He glanced at Kayla, her calm exterior masking the storm he knew was brewing beneath the surface. "Naira," Elias said, stepping forward, "I know you don't trust me, but I'm here because I want to help. We're on the same side." Naira's eyes flicked to him, her expression hard. "You think your words mean anything here, human? You don't understand what's at stake." Kayla's voice cut through the tense silence. "Enough, Naira. If you disrupt the ritual, you'll doom us all." Naira hesitated, her claws retracting slightly, but the warriors at her side shifted, their tension palpable. It was clear they wouldn't back down without a fight. The ground trembled again, the energy from the elder tree growing unstable. Kayla's gaze flicked to Elias, a silent understanding passing between them. They had to finish the ritual, no matter the cost. "Elias," Kayla said quietly, "stay close." Before Elias could respond, Naira lunged, her claws aimed directly at Kayla. The clearing erupted into chaos as the loyalists clashed with Naira's warriors. Elias barely had time to react as Kayla dodged Naira's attack, countering with a swift strike that sent her opponent stumbling back. Elias grabbed a nearby staff, instinct kicking in as he deflected a blow from one of Naira's followers. The clash of wood and claws echoed around him, the ritual forgotten in the heat of battle. Despite the odds, Elias held his ground, his training and determination keeping him steady. Kayla fought with a fierce grace, her movements precise and unrelenting. She pushed Naira back toward the edge of the clearing, their conflict a storm of strength and skill. Elias caught glimpses of their fight between his own skirmishes, the intensity of their clash unmatched. But as the battle raged on, Elias noticed the elder tree's glow beginning to fade. The energy was slipping away, the ritual unraveling. They needed to end this, now. "Kayla," he shouted, dodging another attack. "The tree!" Kayla's eyes flicked to the altar, realization dawning. She feinted a strike, using the momentary distraction to break away from Naira. With a powerful leap, she landed beside Elias, her chest heaving from exertion. "We have to finish the ritual," she said, her voice urgent. "Hold them off as long as you can." Elias nodded, determination flaring in his eyes. Kayla returned to the altar, resuming the chant with renewed vigor. The ancient symbols began to glow once more, their light spreading across the clearing. Elias stood guard, fending off any who dared approach. His arms burned with the effort, but he refused to falter. This was their chance, and he wouldn't let it slip away. Naira, seeing the ritual's resurgence, roared in frustration. She charged toward Kayla, but Elias intercepted her, their weapons clashing with a thunderous crack. "Enough, Naira," he shouted, his voice carrying over the chaos. "This isn't about you or me. It's about saving your people. Naira hesitated, her eyes flickering with doubt. For a moment, it seemed she might relent. But before she could respond, the ground shook violently and a brilliant light erupted from the elder tree, enveloping the clearing in its radiance. The force of the energy knocked everyone off their feet, the world around them dissolving into blinding white. Elias felt a surge of warmth and power, the bond they had sought finally taking hold. When the light faded, silence fell over the clearing. The beast folk slowly rose, their eyes wide with awe. The elder tree stood taller, its branches glowing with a soft, golden light. Kayla approached Elias, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We did it," she said, her voice barely audible. Elias nodded, his heart still racing. But as he looked around, he knew this was only the beginning. The glow of the elder tree gradually dimmed to a steady, golden light, its branches swaying gently as if in silent approval. The clearing was quiet, save for the soft murmurs of the gathered beast folk as they processed what had just happened. The air felt charged with a renewed vitality, an unspoken promise of hope. Elias stood beside Kayla, his breathing heavy as he tried to steady himself. The energy from the ritual still coursed through him, leaving his skin tingling and his heart pounding. He glanced at Kayla, who remained focused on the elder tree, her expression a mix of awe and relief. "It worked," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the quiet hum of the tree's energy. Elias nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We did it." Before either of them could say more, Naira pushed herself up from the ground, her gaze fixed on Kayla. Her expression was a mixture of defiance and reluctant acceptance. Slowly, she approached, her movements cautious as the other beast folk watched in silence. Kayla turned to face her, her posture calm but firm. Naira stopped a few paces away, her hands clenched at her sides. "I doubted you," Naira admitted, her voice low. "I doubted him." She glanced briefly at Elias before returning her focus to Kayla. "But the tree doesn't lie." It chose to respond. Kayla inclined her head slightly. "The bond we forged was real. It was never about one of us. It was about all of us." Naira's jaw tightened, but after a moment, she nodded. "You've proven your point, Kayla. And so has he." She looked at Elias again, her gaze softer now. "You've earned your place here." Elias felt a weight lift from his shoulders at her words. He gave a small nod in return. "Thank you." The tension in the clearing began to dissipate as the beast folk slowly returned to their tasks, their spirits visibly lifted by the tree's renewed vitality. Kayla watched them for a moment before turning back to Elias. "We should rest," she said. "The ritual took a lot out of both of us." Elias agreed, his body still aching from the strain of the past few days. Together, they made their way back to Kayla's tent, the quiet of the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Once inside, Kayla lit a small lantern, casting a warm glow over the space. Elias sank onto the edge of the fur-covered bed, exhaling deeply. "That was intense," he said, his voice laced with exhaustion. Kayla sat beside him, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like days. "You handled it well," she said, a hint of admiration in her tone. "I knew you had the strength, but you've exceeded even my expectations." Elias chuckled softly, running a hand through his hair. "I wasn't so sure myself." Kayla placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but grounding. "You've proven yourself, Elias. Not just to me, but to everyone." Her gaze softened, and for a moment, the weight of leadership seemed to slip away, leaving only the woman who had shared so much of herself with him. Elias met her eyes, a quiet understanding passing between them. "I couldn't have done it without you." Kayla smiled faintly, her hand lingering for a moment before she withdrew it. "Rest now. We'll need our strength for what comes next." Elias nodded, lying back on the bed as Kayla extinguished the lantern. The quiet sounds of the camp outside lulled him into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, the camp was alive with activity. The air buzzed with a renewed sense of purpose as the beast folk began to organize themselves, preparing for the challenges ahead. The ritual had breathed new life into the elder tree, but Kayla and Elias knew their work was far from over. As they walked through the camp, several beast folk stopped to acknowledge Elias, offering nods of respect or brief words of gratitude. The shift in their attitudes was subtle but significant. Elias could feel the change, and it bolstered his resolve. Kayla led him to a gathering near the central fire, where the tribe's elders were waiting. They sat in a semicircle, their expressions serious but hopeful. Naira stood among them, her posture more relaxed than before. One of the elders, a gray-furred beast woman named Talia, spoke first. Kayla, Elias, the tree's resurgence is a sign that our people may yet have a future. But we must not grow complacent. The forces that threaten us are still out there. Kayla nodded. I agree. The ritual was only the first step. We need to strengthen our defenses and continue searching for ways to ensure our survival. Naira stepped forward, her voice steady. We've already sent scouts to monitor the surrounding areas. If there are threats nearby, we'll know soon. Talia looked to Elias, her sharp eyes studying him. And you, human, you've proven your worth, but your journey with us is just beginning. Are you prepared to face what lies ahead? Elias straightened, meeting her gaze with determination. I am. Whatever it takes, I'll stand with you. The elders exchanged approving glances before Talia nodded. Then we moved forward together. The meeting continued as the group discussed strategies and assigned tasks. Elias listened closely, absorbing as much as he could. Despite the challenges they faced, there was a sense of unity among the tribe that gave him hope. As the meeting adjourned, Kayla pulled Elias aside. You've come a long way since you first arrived, she said, but there's still more to learn. Elias nodded, his resolve firm. I'm ready. Kayla smiled, her confidence in him evident. Together, they stepped into the next chapter of their journey, determined to forge a future where both their worlds could thrive. The days following the ritual were a whirlwind of preparation and reconstruction. The energy radiating from the elder tree had revitalized the camp, but Kayla and Elias knew that the hardest challenges were yet to come. The beast folk worked tirelessly to fortify their defenses, gather resources, and train for any impending threats. Elias found himself fully integrated into their daily life. His presence no longer met with suspicion, but with acceptance and trust. Early one morning, Elias stood near the outskirts of the camp, watching as a group of scouts prepared to leave. Kayla approached him, her stride confident, her eyes sharp and focused. She carried a satchel slung over her shoulder, filled with maps and supplies. They'll be gone for a few days, she said, nodding toward the scouts. Their mission is critical. If there are enemies moving against us, we need to know. Elias crossed his arms, concern etched on his face. Do you think they'll find anything? Kayla sighed, her gaze distant for a moment. I hope not, but we can't afford to be unprepared. Elias nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. And what about us? What's our next move? Kayla gave him a small, almost playful smile. We're going to continue your training. There's still much you need to learn. She led him to a secluded part of the forest where the trees grew thick and the air was filled with the earthy scent of moss and pine. The clearing they stopped at was quiet, save for the gentle rustle of leaves. Kayla set down her satchel and removed 2 wooden training staffs, handing one to Elias. Today's focus is on precision and endurance, she said, spinning her staff with practiced ease. We'll push you beyond what you think you can handle. Elias took the staff, his grip firm. I'm ready, he said, determination in his voice. Kayla nodded, her expression serious. Good. Let's begin. They moved through a series of drills, Kayla demonstrating techniques, and Elias following her lead. The rhythm of their movements soon became a dance, the sound of their staffs meeting echoing through the clearing. Kayla pushed him harder with each passing moment, her strikes swift and deliberate. Elias matched her pace as best he could, sweat beading on his brow. His muscles burned, but he refused to give in. Kayla's presence was both a challenge and a motivator, her sharp commands driving him forward. Faster, she barked as she launched a rapid flurry of strikes. Elias met her blows, his focus narrowing to the movements of her staff. His arms ached, his breathing grew ragged, but he pressed on, refusing to falter. With a final burst of energy, he deflected her strike and pivoted, using his momentum to push her back. Kayla stumbled slightly, then laughed, a sound that was rare and filled with genuine amusement. "You're getting better," she said, lowering her staff. "Much better." Elias leaned on his staff, catching his breath. "I had a good teacher." Kayla smiled, her eyes gleaming with pride. She stepped closer, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "You've come far, Elias. You've proven yourself time and again." Elias straightened, his breath steadying. "I couldn't have done it without you." Kayla's gaze softened, and for a moment, the tension between them shifted into something more personal. The bond they had forged was undeniable, built on trust, respect, and shared purpose. She reached out, her hand brushing against his cheek. "You've become more than just an ally," she said quietly. "You're a part of this tribe now." Elias felt a warmth spread through him at her words. He placed his hand over hers, their connection deepening in the quiet stillness of the forest. "And I'll do everything I can to protect it." Kayla leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a soft, lingering kiss. It was a moment of shared solace, a brief escape from the weight of their responsibilities. When they pulled apart, Kayla rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed. "We'll face whatever comes together," she whispered. Elias nodded, his resolve firm. Together. Their moment was interrupted by the distant sound of a horn echoing through the forest. Kayla's eyes snapped open, her expression instantly alert. "That's the signal," she said, her voice tense. "The scouts have returned." They quickly gathered their things and made their way back to the camp. The atmosphere was tense as the scouts rode in, their faces grim. Talia and the other elders were already waiting, their expressions mirroring the concern of those around them. One of the scouts dismounted and approached Kayla, bowing his head briefly. "We found signs of movement near the southern border," he reported. "A group of raiders, possibly preparing to attack." Kayla's jaw tightened. "How many?" "Too many for a direct confrontation," the scout replied. "But we've fortified the border and set up watch points. If they advance, we'll be ready." Kayla nodded, her mind already racing through strategies. She turned to Talia. "We'll need to bolster our defenses and prepare the warriors. There's no time to waste." Talia agreed, her voice steady. "We'll convene a war council immediately." As the camp sprang into action, Elias stayed by Kayla's side, ready to assist in any way he could. The calm after the ritual had been brief, but he knew that peace was never guaranteed. Together, they would face whatever threats came their way, determined to protect the future they had fought so hard to secure. The battle for their survival was far from over, but for the first time, Elias felt truly prepared. He wasn't just a scholar or an outsider anymore. He was a part of something greater, and he would do whatever it took to ensure their people's future.